Look, Vladimir Putin made this easy yesterday before Witkoff showed up. He did a presentation in Russia, and he said, look, we can have a ceasefire right now if Ukraine commits to two things. They have to withdraw from Russian territory. That means all of Kherson, all of Zaporizhia, all of Donetsk, all of Lugansk. And they have to commit that they will never join NATO. This will get them a ceasefire right now as we speak. And then we can move on to negotiating the nuances associated with bringing about conflict termination. But if you want people to stop dying, it can happen instantaneously. Anything less than that, Russia will continue to wage this war until it has liberated the totality of its territory. I can guarantee you, having made that statement before Witkoff showed up, Putin reinforced that statement. And it's not going to change. It's not going to change at all. And I think you'll find once the ceasefire takes place, Trump may have, gotten something he didn't want, because the other Russian objectives aren't going to change either. Just because there's a ceasefire doesn't mean that Russia's not going to insist on demilitarization. Right.
I mean, let's be real here. Putin's offer is basically total Ukrainian capitulation dressed as a peace plan. It's framed as if he's the reasonable adult in the room, but those demands are maximalist and leave Ukraine gutted strategically. From my experience, when an adversary lays down terms this rigid, it's less about genuine diplomacy and more about locking in war gains.
The Russians, they've never closed the door on diplomacy. And the Russians, they're very honest about, what they will do. And when they say they're going to do something, they're going to do it. And the consistency in their argument over time has even brought about begrudging respect by Donald Trump, who says they're tough guys. They're stubborn people. The Russians have never once yielded to any of the pressure put on or the threats made by Donald Trump.
So the question here is, does Trump actually grasp what Putin's asking, or is he being sold the Peace Now headline without the fine print? In geopolitics, optimism without situational realism is a dangerous mix, especially if the intermediary filters the hard truths.
And I think Trump recognizes this in the most simplistic word. What he needed to hear was that there's a path forward. And I think what Witkoff said is that we can get a ceasefire now. And that's all Trump cares about. I mean, Judge, I don't mean to be disrespectful here, but the president doesn't care about Ukrainian lives. He doesn't care about Russian lives. He doesn't care about the national security of the United States. He doesn't care about Europe, NATO, or any of that. He cares about getting a Nobel Peace Prize. That's it.
Here's the thing. Giving Russia credit for honesty in intentions is tricky. Yes, they tend to signal their red lines clearly, but that doesn't mean those lines are just or negotiable. Trump seeing only a path forward without weighing the cost suggests he's treating this like a PR milestone rather than a geopolitical chess match.
Listen to the statement he made the other day. I have stopped 5 wars. The 6th one I'm about to stop. And then he always says, I'm the guy for the Nobel Peace. He bribes the Cambodians to nominate him. This is all he wants. It comes down to this is the supreme narcissist. And because he wants to be seen as the man who brought an end to the war, I think the president has heard from Witkoff a scenario where the war can be brought to an end. Now the president needs to put pressure on Ukraine to accept a result that is inevitable.
That's blunt, but not unfounded. If Trump's driving motivation here is a trophy, the Nobel, rather than a sustainable peace, the risk is enormous. This turns high-stakes conflict resolution into a branding exercise where optics trump, pun intended, substance.
I mean, this war ends when the United States sits down with the Ukrainians and say, you're going to lose all that territory. There's nothing we can do to help you. You're going to lose it all. Yeah. Well, he become a narcissistic neocon, which means he puts his own narcissism ahead of neocon principles and ideologies, which I don't think he can even articulate. The problem is he's surrounded himself with neocons. And so he's getting just horrible advice. The United States needs to find a way to get a team B assembled, trained up, and brought before this president to show him alternatives.
Wait, so he's now a neocon? That's a striking shift, especially for someone who campaigned on ending forever wars. If the prescription is to strong-arm Ukraine into surrender while still arming them, that's a muddled and frankly contradictory position.
Witkoff is a breath of fresh air, but again, it's very difficult for Witkoff to have any credibility left because as a negotiator, remember, he was undermined by the president in the Iranian negotiation where he was telling the Iranians that there was going to be a fifth round of negotiations. We're moving forward. And then Israel bombed them with America's blessing. So from the Russian perspective, they got to take Steve Witkoff with a grain of salt. But I do believe that the Russians are very honest and very sincere about having a ceasefire as long as they get all of their territories. And if the president can't guarantee that, if Ukraine's unwilling to do it, then this war doesn't stop. And I think that's the point that Putin made to Witkoff. This war doesn't stop unless these conditions are met. But look at the simplicity of the conditions. There's only two things now. Get out of the territory and no NATO. Now you have a ceasefire. As opposed to, if you remember, the Russians were saying there's no reason why we can have a ceasefire until all the root causes of this conflict are addressed. This is a major shift on the part of the Russians.
Correct.
They've taken 25 moving parts, and now they have 2 moving parts to get the ceasefire. That's why I think Trump's excited.
So this is where it gets messy. If Trump's inner circle is dominated by neocon voices, his policy compass will be skewed toward confrontation. And the Russians narrowing their ceasefire conditions from many to just 2, that's notable, but it's still a total win for them, not a balanced deal.
Well, first of all, I think that came back to bite the president in the butt. This president, we've had this conversation before about the irresponsibility of directing the movement of all high-class submarines through social media posting. Look how quickly the president backed away from this. Because I think he was read the Riot Act by people who are supposed to read him the Riot Act, not Hegseth, because Hegseth is just a bootlicker, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not raising Kane because he's a bootlicker, but the rest of the generals who got bypassed by Kane came to Kane and said, no, this isn't how it works. They had a strategic command. This isn't how it works. This can't happen. And the president backed away. And then the other thing that happened is the Russians now have done a repeat of the deployment of the SS-20 missile in the 1970s. When the Russians first fielded the SS-20 road mobile intermediate nuclear range missile, intermediate range nuclear missile back in the late 1970s, they totally fundamentally altered the balance of power in Europe and created a crisis that resulted in the United States being compelled to deploy its own INF systems. But even then, the Russians had the event. The Erratic is a game changer in every way, shape, and form. It's now in serial production, and the Russians are now deploying it. They've said we're no longer held by the moratorium that been this deployment. The Russians have overnight changed the entire strategic calculus in Europe. And even the president, who is simplistic, this is not a hard thing for him to understand. And I do believe that he is being briefed on the consequences of this. Remember, he's the one who pulled out of the INF treaty to begin with. He created this problem. But this is also a new calculation.
Are you kidding me? Announcing sub-movements on social media is amateur hour in nuclear strategy. Combine that with the SS-20-like deployment, and we're watching a return to Cold War-era deterrence crises, except now with social media blunders in the mix.
So I think what's happening is the president is hopefully waking up to the fact that he's just getting bad advice from people. And maybe he'll start asking questions, and those questions will lead to him seeking solutions from other people. Maybe Witkoff's star will rise. Witkoff is ably assisted here. He has Kirill Dmitriev, who is a brilliant banker, investor with experience here in the United States and some of the big banks. He knows the American economy inside and out, and he's very optimistic about the potential of good relations between Russia and the United States that are economically viable, music to the president's ears. So you notice that Mr. Dugan said, for the moment, has
correct.
Lost his.
Correct.
I believe that this president can be brought back to the principles. And this is, again, until we know the details, but I do believe that Vladimir Putin has delivered in typical fashion diplomatic genius because he's advised from some of the sharpest minds out there. Lavrov, who you've met, and others. And I believe that he has put something on the table that has been specifically crafted to solve the political problems of this president. And if this president can find in his gut the intellectual and moral courage to move on this and act on this, I do think that the guns can fall silent soon. But the key is the Ukrainians have to evacuate these territories. Without that, there is no ceasefire.
To my knowledge, when a diplomatic offer is tailored to solve the domestic political headaches of your opponent rather than resolve the underlying conflict, it's a trap in strategic wrapping paper. This isn't peace. It's a negotiated surrender under PR-friendly terms.
Normally in the military, if I'm going to spit shine my boot, back in the day, because today they issue these brown side out boots that you brush, but you used to get issued these black leather boots, and you had to spend ungodly hours shining those babies up. I mean, that's the story that he has, that we've deployed B-61-12 gravity bombs, nuclear gravity bombs to England for the first time in some time. It's an interesting story, because then the question is, under what authority? Are these part of the NATO deterrent? We already have 100+ gravity B-61 gravity bombs deployed in 5 locations throughout NATO, in Turkey, in Belgium, in Italy, and Netherlands. Is this a new deployment as part of the NATO nuclear deterrence, or is this a bilateral nuclear arrangement with the British that falls outside of the NATO nuclear deterrence, which would be very worrisome, because then it implies for deploying bombs that could be loaded onto B-2s and used in a preemptive strike. And you combine that potential of a preemptive strike with pushing Ohio-class submarines closer to Russian, and you've just created an inherently dangerous situation.
I mean, this is where it gets alarming fast. If nuclear deployments are happening outside NATO's formal deterrent framework, that's not just saber rattling, that's shifting toward preemptive strike posturing. Historically, that's a recipe for miscalculation.
That's 100% act of desperation. First of all, as he issued that statement, did you see, Judge, 600 former Israeli intelligence, military intelligence, Mossad, Shin Bet? We're talking about the cream of the crop. It's not 6, it's not 50, it's not 51, it's 600 came out and said that the Gaza policy is a disaster. And that is the consensus. That means that there is an absolute consensus amongst the professionals of Israel that this ain't going to happen. So Netanyahu saying this is not going to translate in the Israelis doing this. It's an act of political posturing by a man who is increasingly finding himself boxed in by reality, both in terms of his own domestic legal problems, which Donald Trump's social media postings can't undo, and the fact that Hamas is just kicking the crap out of the Israelis on a daily basis. The Israelis are taking casualties and are not achieving discernible outcomes. And Israel's reputation around the world is collapsing. The starvation of children, the ongoing slaughter of Palestinians seeking the food as they're being starved. This is the world is turning on it. You got Europe right now just lining up to recognize a Palestinian state, unheard of. And so, Netanyahu, the only thing he knows is the counterattack, and he's threatening something that he won't be able to implement.
This whole situation is ridiculous. When your own top intelligence and military veterans publicly say your core policy is doomed, doubling down isn't strategy, it's political survival theater, and it comes at a steep cost in legitimacy.